So here we go. Framework laptops, okay? Now, here's my problem. When I'm looking at this, to me, one of the most important things is a numpad, a pointer stick, right? Because unfortunately, you're going to have to, at some point, use the graphical user environment, and you're going to have to use that pointer stick if you have one. Otherwise, you're going to have to use the trackpad, and I'm not going to use the trackpad. I'm not going to use a mouse. Now, there possibly or probably is a workaround where, and I have done a video on this, where you can technically use your keyboard as a mouse, and you can have, again, you can, the great thing about keyboard, you can do almost just about anything you want with it on Linux. But I do not want to be, this is the thing, the graphical user interface is great on a phone, right? You use your finger. The graphical user interface, as far as I'm concerned, by design, is a bad design. And I've gone into this in the videos. Anybody who's listening to this, watch those videos if you want to see my whole opinion on graphical user interfaces. So to me, if the focus is the keyboard, but I am going to be compromised by having to use the mouse and I don't have a track point, I'm not going to be using that laptop. Something I'm not really going to split the difference on. The other thing is, where I've been talking about hardware, unless I'm going to be doing gaming or, let's say, very heavy processing, whether it's graphical or not, I'm not going to need something like a framework laptop. And if I look at some of the prices here, how much are these? I mean, £1,400, that's a lot of money. If I've got an old ThinkPad, they're relatively modular anyway. This is the tragedy of some new hardware, that it's all soldered together, and this ironic sense that now if you want to replace a battery easily, you've got to spend well over £1,400 on the latest hardware to be able to do that, or you have to settle for it all being like soldered together. Imagine buying your car. I mean, maybe that's the case, probably is the case with modern electric cars, but imagine buying your car and you can't open the bonnet. You're not allowed to open the bonnet of the car, right? You literally cannot do anything. Maybe that's what a modern Tesla is. I don't know. Because, of course, there is really no bonnet in a Tesla, is there? Because it's just an electric motor and software and batteries and some seats and airbags or whatever. So maybe this is it now. You don't really have access or own your hardware. So if you need that in a framework laptop, you need a powerful laptop that is modular, that's fine. But for myself, if I'm put in perspective of future proofing, what I'm thinking is, okay, I spend a lot of time writing screenplays, for example, or I spend a lot of time writing. That's my main focus. So for me, and most importantly anyway, it's having a keyboard. And secondly, my computer use is keyboard centric, almost exclusively, with obvious exceptions. But my main focus and drive is, even just to the TTY, I don't even have access to a mouse. I know you've got GPM or whatever, but I don't even have that installed. I don't use that. I don't like that. I don't need that. And even when I'm in the graphical user environment, I have things automated. I almost exclusively now don't well, I haven't for a long time, used the mouse. Meaning that that's the first and possibly the most important thing. That design feature, to me, is the design feature of a laptop or even a desktop computer, is the keyboard. Irrespective of Libre software, irrespective of even the operating system. Then if I broke it down, what's the next issue? Well, it will be the operating system, right? Because if I'm using Windows and my focus is using the keyboard, I can't really utilize the keyboard in any meaningful way, because the, the kind of environment that Windows is, like I've covered in the previous video, you don't have options. I've done my best in previous years when I did have Windows. A brief time I went back to Windows, and I tried really, really hard to make it a keyboard centric. I spent, months, and I just couldn't. And then there were other things which doesn't really matter, but that was a huge issue. And I just, again, it kind of was like one of the final straws that made me never ever wanting to use Windows for my personal use again. Then let me put it this way. So if you're obviously going to Linux, right? And you're learning Linux, let's say. If you learn Linux down to its core components, you break down the, the cliche GNU/Linux. It is by definition the Linux kernel with the core utilities, right? Those are the kind of the most important things, right? So when you break it down to that, and to my mind, you break it down to the core components. You have sensible defaults. So something like Arch Linux is your sensible default. Then from there, you have your base install, and you build up the things that are most important to you. So whatever it is, and mine is focus is the TTY, the non-graphical environment, and then obviously I have to have a graphical environment for mainly the web browser, and I don't know, maybe some other exceptions. So really, it's partly a process, and it's partly breaking the problem down, because really what the whole thing we're talking about here is that our options are limited, right? We've got problems. We have problems with computing, or we have a specific problem. Mine ultimately came back to screenwriting. So again, the keyboard is the most important thing. Having a good laptop keyboard, or having a laptop keyboard as well for the operating system, that I can do what I need to do. And I can only really do that with something like Linux, or I guess BSD. So it's layers of importance, and it's a process, and you've got to break it down into components, so to speak. So again, for me, if I go back to the Framework laptop, and my first thing is, okay, I want a keyboard, right? A nice keyboard. And I'm sure Framework make nice keyboards, but a cliche ThinkPad, secondhand or brand new at a more reasonable price, I'm gonna get a good keyboard if it's in good condition. And then if I'm getting a secondhand ThinkPad, for example, unless I need, if I've got the keyboard I need, unless I'm playing video games, to me, there's no reason to spend that money. But I can't speak for everyone. I can't speak for yourself. But my instinct, if I did need that extra power, that computer power, my instinct would be a ThinkPad still. I wouldn't be happy with the situation. Maybe Framework laptops, or even System 76 computers, are the inheritor of the old ThinkPad style. But how can you not have a pointer stick? And again, I do not want to have to leave the home row. Leaving the home row is like a sin. You know, it's a design that I'm escaping from the point of a laptop computer. It's the keyboard. It's not the mouse. So I hope that's sort of broken it down in a different context. I'm not really dissing on framework laptops or computers, so to speak, but it's just saying that, do you need to go down that route to buy one? Is it worth it? You know, in a way, is just a good condition secondhand ThinkPad with the appropriate computing power that will should future-proof you, despite the situation with probably desktop Linux in the future, and certainly why you're running Windows if you're running Windows. But don't get me wrong, if you're running a 10, 15, 16-year-old ThinkPad and you intend to run Windows on it, then clearly you're not doing it right, because you're not going to be able to run Windows 11 properly. You'd have to, you know, hack it or whatever it is to run Windows 11 now on an older computer. But you're probably going to have no RAM left, because it's going to just idle it all in the background while you do nothing. So you're not going to be future-proofing that ThinkPad if, you know, you're in a situation where you're running Windows 11. However, if you're running a light desktop environment, hey, it's probably going to be a lot better. Even better, if you're running a window manager, you're going to be idling at 100 to 120 megabytes, probably. That's how I do it on my my ThinkPad X201, which is nearly 15 years old now. I've got two of them. It effectively idles at, you know, 100 to 120 megabytes. My 32-bit ThinkPad running Hyperbola idles at about 70 megabytes. So in the TTY, and I think in the GUI, well, in the window manager, it's probably about another 10 megabytes. I don't know, 80, 90 megabytes at most. So again, there's a lot at play here. When I talk about, you know, computer elitism, and I've been accused of this, I'm really saying it from a design perspective. I'm trying to explain why things are the way they are, why things are not necessarily better the way they are. But I'd never, and I've said this before, I'd never tell anybody to go against what they need to do. For example, if they were running a business, I wouldn't tell them, for example, not to have suddenly say somebody's got a business, right, and they use Shopify. That's where their shop is and all this kind of stuff. And they go to me, oh, you know, you're against, you know, this kind of commercialism on the web, and that I'm going to delete my Shopify account and disappoint all my customers, and my family are going to starve because I can't fulfill orders. I'll be like, what are you doing? You're mad. Why are you listening to this dude on the internet, you know, taking it to, you know, to some sort of fundamentalism? You know, this is your business. Why would you do that to yourself? Do you see what I mean? I'm not that kind of person. But what I would say is, I don't think a lot of these things are necessarily good by design. I don't think they're necessarily good for our lives. I don't even think they're necessarily good for how we run some of these businesses. So, but it's not. It's not like it's not like being a fundamentalist about this, if that makes sense. Again, it's like anything in life. If you're considering a couple of things, right? If you're considering, okay, I want a computer for the long term that I can effectively repair, can replace parts or do what I need to it, Secondly, I'm considering I need a computer that has this amount of power. So obviously, you've got to weigh those things up. Now, you might have a situation where the computer you're looking at fulfills the repairability aspect. It might not even be a framework laptop. It might be an old ThinkPad, right? And you're thinking, okay, so this amount of power will probably last me for a couple of years because, you know, the way things develop, the kernel and the graphical desktop environment and all this kind of stuff is going to become greater and greater and greater. It's going to become many more gigabytes, you know, over years. So if you're looking at thinking, I want to future-proof this, I like this style of laptop, but you've got this issue where you know you can't use it in a couple of years. However, there's another ThinkPad out there that is much more powerful, but it doesn't have the upgradability or the replaceable parts that are easily replaceable, for example. Then you're going to have to think, well, this is more important to me because I can't do my work without having this more powerful laptop. Then you might think, okay, but I've seen these framework laptops, and so this can fulfill all of my things. Yes, I've got to compromise. I haven't got a pointer stick or a num stick or whatever it's called. I can't even think what it's called. The pointer stick, right? And there's this and that. But hey, this fulfills, you know, 80% of what I need. Of course, and money's either no object or the money's the right. Obviously, you get the framework laptop. Let me put it this way. I'm not going to be going, you have to use a ThinkPad X60 because of some fundamentalist principle. No, of course I'm not going to say that. So I hope that kind of puts that in perspective. I hope I've sort of covered what I think about these things in as best way as possible.